In the heart of Africa lies a remote and mystical village, nestled in a valley where the sun kissed the earth with abundant warmth. This village, surrounded by lush green hills and whispering winds, was unique for its peculiar fear, a fear of shadows. In The Village That Feared Shadows, we delve into the tale of how this strange fear came to be, and how a young boy's courage and wisdom led to a remarkable transformation. This is a story of fear, resilience, and the boundless power of understanding. The village of Nzomo was nestled deep in the folds of a sprawling, sunlit valley. Its people were farmers, herders, and artisans who thrived under the generous warmth of the sun. For as long as anyone could remember, Nzomo had been a place of perpetual brightness. Sunlight streamed through every corner during the day, and at night the village shimmered under the glow of countless fires, lamps, and reflective surfaces that adorned every home. The people of Nzomo believed that light was life itself. Elders often said that darkness brought decay, sickness, and sorrow. They told stories of a time long ago when the village was plunged into shadow for 3 days and nights. During those days, crops withered, animals fell sick, and villagers mourned inexplicable losses. The elders claimed that a wandering shadow spirit had cursed the village, leaving it in ruins until a great sacrifice was made to banish the darkness. Since then, fear of shadows became a part of their way of life. Children were taught to stay away from dark corners and forbidden to play outside as the sun began to set. Mothers would scold them for running too close to the shade of a tree, warning them that shadows could cling to their feet and follow them home. To ensure no dark space remained, every house was fitted with reflective stones and polished metal that captured and amplified the light of their torches. The result was a glowing village that never truly experienced night. Amari was different from the other children. His mind brimmed with questions, but in a village where curiosity was often met with sharp reprimands, he quickly learned to keep his thoughts to himself. Why did they fear shadows so much? Were they truly as dangerous as the elders claimed? Sometimes, when Amari lay in his small, sun-dappled room, he would trace the faint patterns of the shadows cast by leaves swaying outside his window. They looked harmless, even beautiful, but he never dared to speak of this to anyone. One evening, as the sun dipped lower than usual, Amari was returning from the river with a bundle of firewood. He paused to tie the bundle more securely, and as he bent down, he noticed something peculiar. His shadow stretched long and thin on the path in front of him, moving every time he shifted his body. At first, his heart raced. Was this the shadow spirit the elders had warned him about? But as he watched, his fear gave way to curiosity. He waved his hand and the shadow mimicked him. He jumped and the shadow jumped too. It seemed harmless, even playful. Yet, Amari knew better than to share his thoughts. The villagers would not understand. He quickened his pace, eager to reach home before his absence drew attention. That night, as the village prepared for the lighting of the evening fires, Amari couldn't shake the image of his shadow. His best friend, Nia, noticed his distraction. "You're quiet tonight," she said, her voice low so as not to draw the attention of the nearby elders. Amari hesitated, but decided to confide in her. "Nia, have you ever watched your shadow? I mean, really watched it?" Her eyes widened, and she looked around nervously. "Amari, you shouldn't talk about such things. Shadows are dangerous. My grandmother says they can follow you home and steal your spirit." "But what if that's not true?" Amari pressed. "What if shadows are just there? What if they're not dangerous at all?" Nia shook her head. "You mustn't say these things. If the elders hear you, they'll think you're challenging the old ways. It's better to leave such thoughts alone." Though Nia's words were meant as a warning, they only strengthened Amari's resolve. He couldn't ignore what he had seen. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the shadow had moved with him, as though it was a part of him. The more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that the elders' tales might be wrong. Determined to learn the truth, Amari decided to observe shadows more closely. For the next few days, he spent his afternoons outside, watching how the sun played with objects and created dark shapes on the ground. He noticed how the shadows changed depending on the time of day, and how even the smallest object, like a pebble, could cast a shadow. The more he observed, the more he was certain that shadows were not the sinister spirits the villagers believed them to be. Then came the moment that would change everything. One late afternoon, as the sun began to sink low and the sky turned golden, Amari sat near the edge of the village. He had wandered farther than usual, drawn by his growing curiosity. He watched as the shadow of a large tree stretched across the ground, its branches creating intricate patterns. Without thinking, Amari reached out and placed his hand into the shadow. It felt like nothing. It was just the ground beneath his hand. His heart raced with excitement. What he had just done felt forbidden, yet it also felt right. Shadows were not alive, nor were they dangerous. They were simply the absence of light. But how could he convince an entire village to believe something so contrary to everything they had been taught? As Amari walked back home that evening, he knew that his discoveries would not be easily accepted. Yet, the thought of keeping this knowledge to himself felt unbearable. He would have to find a way to share what he had learned, no matter the risks. Amari couldn't sleep that night. The thought of his secret experiment in the forest consumed him. He knew the risks. Venturing into the woods after sunset was considered an act of defiance against the elders and their teachings. The forest was a place of mystery and fear, where shadows gathered thick and unbroken. Stories passed down through generations spoke of spirits that roamed there, waiting to ensnare those foolish enough to wander into their domain. But Amari's curiosity had grown beyond fear. He had to know the truth. The shadows in the village were tame compared to the forest, where the canopy of trees allowed only shards of moonlight to break through. If he could find answers there, he might be able to prove once and for all that shadows were not the ominous forces the elders claimed them to be. He waited until the village settled into the stillness of the night. The soft hum of voices gave way to the crackling of the ceremonial fires, and soon even those grew faint. Wrapping himself in a dark cloak to blend with the night, Amari slipped out of his home and made his way toward the edge of the forest. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped onto the narrow path that led into the dense undergrowth. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig. Every noise seemed amplified in the stillness, making Amari flinch despite his determination. The deeper he went, the darker it became. The moonlight struggled to pierce through the thick canopy, casting fragmented patterns on the forest floor. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. Amari paused near a large clearing where a single beam of moonlight illuminated a small patch of ground. He knelt, feeling the cool earth beneath his fingers. His own shadow stretched long and faint, barely visible in the dim light. He waved his hand, and the shadow waved back. It was a small, simple act, but it filled him with a strange sense of connection. The shadow wasn't malevolent. It was a reflection of himself, tethered to him like a quiet companion. He began to experiment. Picking up a stick, he held it upright in the moonbeam, watching how its shadow formed a thin line on the ground. When he tilted the stick, the shadow bent and grew. He placed a flat stone in the light, observing how its edges created a sharp, dark outline. Each new discovery thrilled him. Shadows were not random, he realized. They followed rules. They depended on the shape and position of the objects that cast them, as well as the angle of the light. But the most startling moment came when Amari turned his attention to the shadows of the trees. Their branches, intertwined and gnarled, cast shadows that looked like giant, outstretched hands. For a moment, his fear returned. The shadows seemed to move as though alive, reaching for him. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. Then he noticed something. The shadows moved only when the wind rustled the leaves. It wasn't magic or spirits. It was the trees responding to the wind, their shadows dancing in rhythm. He stood there for what felt like hours, watching the interplay of light and darkness. The forest, once a place of fear, had transformed in his mind into a realm of wonder. The shadows were not to be feared, but understood. They were not entities of malice, but simply an expression of light's absence, a balance that was as natural as the sun itself. Amari's thoughts turned to the villagers. How could he explain this to them? The elders had instilled fear so deeply that even the simplest shadow was seen as a threat. If he were to speak of what he had seen, would they even listen? Or would they dismiss him as a foolish boy who had defied their sacred traditions? As the first hints of dawn began to light the sky, Amari realized he needed proof. He couldn't rely on words alone to convince the village of what he had discovered. He had to show them, to make them see with their own eyes that shadows were not dangerous but beautiful and fascinating. Gathering a few small stones, branches and leaves, he arranged them in the clearing, creating patterns that the rising sun would reveal. Then he hurried back to the village before anyone noticed his absence. His heart was light despite the danger that lay ahead. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and now he had a plan to share it. It was risky, but Amari was ready to face whatever came. His experiment had opened his eyes, and there was no turning back. The day of the village festival arrived, a time of celebration and tradition that brought all the villagers together. The festival was a day to honor the sun, their most sacred and revered force of nature. The village was alive with the sound of drums, songs, and laughter. Brightly colored fabrics adorned the huts, and the scent of roasted yams and spiced stews filled the air. It was a time when the villagers felt closest to the light, reaffirming their commitment to keeping darkness at bay. Amari had spent the morning nervously preparing for what he knew could be the most important and dangerous moment of his life. His plan was bold, bordering on defiant. But he believed in what he had discovered and knew he had to share it with the people even if they rejected him. He had constructed a makeshift screen from a white cloth stretched tightly between two poles, and behind it he placed a lantern. In his hands, he held carefully selected objects, leaves, carved wooden animals and small stones that he would use to create shadow images. As the festival reached its peak, the elders called the villagers to gather near the ceremonial fire. It was time for the traditional retelling of the story of the shadow spirit. The oldest elder, a man named Bako, began in his deep, resonant voice, recounting the tale of the wandering shadow that had cursed the village generations ago. His words were heavy with foreboding, and the villagers listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others clutching their children close. When Bako finished, the crowd fell silent as it always did at the end of the tale. The fire crackled, its flames casting flickering shadows that the villagers avoided looking at too closely. It was in this moment of quiet unease that Amari stepped forward. "Elders," he began, his voice steady but loud enough to carry over the murmurs that followed his unexpected appearance. "And my fellow villagers, I ask for your attention. I have something to show you, a truth about shadows that I believe we all need to see." The crowd stirred uneasily. Whispers spread like wildfire, and Bako's stern gaze bore into Amari. "What is the meaning of this?" the elder demanded. "Do you dare to interrupt our sacred traditions?" "I mean no disrespect," Amari replied, bowing slightly. "But I have spent many days and nights learning about the shadows we fear, and I believe they are not what we think they are. Please, allow me to show you." The villagers looked to the elders, who huddled together in hushed conversation. After a tense moment, Bako raised a hand for silence. "We will permit this demonstration," he said reluctantly. "But you will bear the consequences if this disrupts the harmony of the festival." Amari nodded, grateful for the chance. He gestured toward the screen and lit the lantern behind it. As the light illuminated the cloth, he held up a carved wooden bird. Its shadow appeared on the screen, large and graceful. The crowd gasped, some in awe, others in fear. "This is a shadow," Amari explained. "It is not alive, nor is it a spirit. It is simply the shape created when light is blocked by an object." He moved the bird closer to the lantern, and the shadow grew smaller. He pulled it away, and the shadow stretched larger. Then he used his hands to create the shape of a dog, making it bark and wag its tail. The children laughed, their fear momentarily forgotten, but the adults watched warily. Next, Amari placed a leafy branch in front of the light, creating intricate patterns of overlapping shadows. "Shadows can be beautiful," he said. "They are not here to harm us. They are a natural part of the light we worship." The crowd was divided. Some were mesmerized, their long-held fears challenged by the simple beauty of what they saw. Others clung tightly to their traditions, their expressions hard and distrustful. The elders whispered among themselves, their faces grave. "Enough!" Bako's voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. "You play with fire, boy. You mock our beliefs with your tricks and illusions. Shadows have brought nothing but suffering to this village, and you dare to call them beautiful?" "I do not mock," Amari replied, his voice firm. "I only seek to understand. Elders, you say shadows bring suffering, but have you ever seen a shadow harm anyone? Have you ever questioned why we fear them?" The villagers turned to the elders, their curiosity piqued despite their fear. Bako frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "It is not our place to question the ways of our ancestors," he said. "But what if our ancestors were wrong?" Amari countered. His words hung in the air, a challenge that no one dared to voice aloud. The tension in the crowd was palpable. At that moment, a child stepped forward. It was Nia's younger brother, Kofi, his wide eyes filled with wonder. "The shadows aren't scary," he said, reaching toward the screen. "They're just like drawings." His innocent words broke the spell. A few villagers nodded hesitantly, while others shifted uncomfortably. Nia, emboldened by her brother's courage, stepped forward as well. "Amari is right," she said. "We've been afraid for so long, but we've never asked why. Maybe it's time we did." The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their authority shaken. Bako, however, remained resolute. "You have sown doubt in our traditions, boy," he said. "You will answer for this." Amari stood tall, unflinching. "I am ready to answer, but I ask only that you see for yourselves. Come with me to the forest. Face the shadows, and you will understand what I have seen." His words hung in the air, a bold invitation that challenged generations of fear. The villagers looked to the elders for guidance, their expressions a mixture of hope and trepidation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the village forever. The village of Nzomo awoke to an air of tension. The events of the festival had stirred something deep within the hearts of its people. Whispers of Amari's demonstration spread quickly, dividing the villagers. Some dismissed him as a reckless boy who dared to challenge their sacred traditions, while others, particularly the younger generation, felt a glimmer of curiosity. What if he was right? What if shadows were not the terrifying entities they had been taught to fear? The elders convened early that morning, their faces grim and weary. Elder Bako, their leader, sat at the center of the circle, his deep-set eyes shadowed with worry. "This boy has sown discord among us," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "If we allow this to continue, our unity and our traditions will unravel." "But what if the boy is onto something?" Elder Mala, the village healer, asked hesitantly. Her voice was soft, but carried weight. "He speaks with conviction. Perhaps it is worth understanding what he has seen," Bako frowned. "Our ancestors have taught us to fear the shadows. To question them is to question the very foundation of our lives." The discussion grew heated, with some elders siding with Bako and others, like Mala, advocating for exploration. Finally, they reached a decision. The elders would accompany Amari into the forest. If the shadows proved harmless, they would reconsider their teachings. If not, Amari would face punishment for his defiance. When the decision was announced, the villagers gathered in hushed anticipation. Amari stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding but his expression calm. Nia was beside him, her steady presence giving him strength. "You have asked us to see what you have seen," Bako said, addressing Amari. "We will do so, but be warned. If this is a trick or an illusion, you will answer for it." Amari bowed respectfully. "I understand, Elder. I ask only that you keep your hearts open." The group set out for the forest later that afternoon, accompanied by a mix of curious villagers and skeptical elders. The journey was silent but tense, the weight of generations of fear hanging over them. As they entered the dense canopy, the familiar brightness of the village gave way to the cool, dappled light of the woods. Shadows stretched and shifted around them, and a few villagers murmured prayers under their breath. Amari led them to the clearing where he had conducted his experiments. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting intricate patterns on the forest floor. He stopped and turned to face the group. "This is where I learned the truth," he said, his voice steady, despite the nervous energy in the air. Bako crossed his arms. "Show us then." Amari began by demonstrating how shadows were created. He picked up a branch and held it in the sunlight, showing how its shadow stretched across the ground. He explained how the angle of the light changed the shape and size of the shadow, using simple but clear language that even the youngest villagers could understand. Then he asked the villagers to participate. He handed stones, leaves, and small sticks to the children, encouraging them to hold the objects in the light and watch the shadows they created. Their initial hesitation gave way to giggles and fascination as they discovered how they could manipulate the shapes. "See?" Amari said, his voice growing more confident. "The shadows do not harm us. They are not spirits. They are simply shapes made by light." Elder Mala stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. She picked up a large flat rock and placed it in the sunlight. Its shadow formed a crisp outline on the ground. "And yet," she said, "the stories of the shadow spirit remain. How do you explain the darkness that once plagued our village?" Amari met her gaze. "Perhaps the darkness was not caused by shadows, but by our fear of them. Fear can be as powerful as any spirit. It can blind us to the truth and keep us trapped in the past." The villagers murmured among themselves, their fear beginning to unravel in the face of Amari's quiet conviction. Even the elders, though reluctant, seemed moved by his words. But Bako remained unconvinced. "These are clever tricks," he said, "but they do not erase the pain our ancestors endured." "Then let us face the shadows together," Amari said, stepping into a particularly dark patch of the clearing. "If they are truly dangerous, let them harm me now." The crowd held its breath as Amari stood in the shadow. Nothing happened. He reached down and touched the ground, his hand passing easily through the darkness. Slowly, others began to join him, stepping cautiously into the shaded areas. The children were the first, laughing and running through the shadows, followed by the braver adults. Even Elder Mala stepped forward, her skepticism fading. Finally, only Bako remained. The elder's face was a mask of conflict as he watched his people standing in the shadows without fear. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his movements deliberate. The shadow enveloped him, and for a moment, the entire clearing was silent. Then Bako looked up, his expression unreadable. Amari waited, his heart pounding. "Elder?" he asked softly. Bako met his gaze. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we have been wrong." The villagers erupted into murmurs, their voices a mixture of relief and disbelief. For generations, they had lived in fear of shadows, and now that fear was beginning to dissolve. It was a moment of transformation, a turning point for the village. From that day forward, the people of Nzomo began to embrace both light and shadow. The reflective stones and torches remained, but they were no longer symbols of fear. Instead, they became tools of beauty and creativity, used to play with light and create art. The shadows that had once terrified them were now seen as companions, a natural balance to the light they cherished. Amari's courage and curiosity had changed everything, proving that even the deepest fears could be overcome with understanding. And though the elders continued to guard the old stories, they allowed room for new ones, stories of a boy who taught his village to see the world with fresh eyes.